Okay, so we'll just start this session on how to write a popular science book. Welcome to Olive
Yeah.
Heffernan and myself. We're going to chat about this for the next hour or so. This is a chat I've been looking forward to. How are you doing, Olive?
Yeah, great. Yeah, really looking forward to this too. I've been wanting to ask you about book writing for ages, so a good excuse. Yeah.
So we're going to talk. There's a couple of questions that we're both going to answer actually, because you're in the process of finishing up a book. I did a book 10 years ago, and I've written another one, which we might or might not talk about. But maybe we'll start with this. So when did you first decide you were a science journalist for a good
Yeah.
years? So when did you decide that you wanted to write a book, which is a big extra thing to take on?
Yeah, well, I think, I was sort of thinking about it in 2018. So I think there were a few things that, fed into it. At the time, I was freelancing and I had sort of covered climate change for maybe 10 years, basically, kind of at Nature and other places. When I left Nature, I was freelancing, covered a lot of climate change. But my background was in marine biology and in fishery science. And I had sort of found my way back to covering oceans. And because I'd taken such a break from it, it just seemed really exciting and really fresh. And I guess I was writing a good few articles, in marine conservation. And I just thought, there were pragmatic reasons that I thought, well, maybe I could turn this into something. But then there was also this idea that I came across, and it became a bit like an itch that I had to scratch. So I thought that would be a great idea for a book. And I was sort of mulling all of this over. And then in 2018, towards the end of 2018, I went to this session that was held by ABSW in London, which was how to write a popular science book. And there was a panel of people, a couple of people who I'd worked with, and they just talked through the practicalities of it. And so I think that sort of just gave me the confidence to think, okay, I know how to start this process and I know what to expect from it to some extent. So that sort of got the ball rolling for me. Like it was a seed that I was thinking about, and then that just sort of set me on my way to think, yeah, I think I can do this.
Determined. Yeah. So it has to.
Yeah.
This
What
is my.
about you?
So that's 10 years old now. So basically, the way that happened, how Irish scientists changed the world, and it's different from your book because it was aimed at an Irish market.
Yeah.
My intention with it, that you know, it came from the fact that I'm interested in history as well as science, which is kind of
Mm.
I guess, and interested in science history and Irish science history. And I was coming across these characters from mainly from the 19th century, like Kelvin, like Tyndall, like Beaufort, that had a huge impact on the British Empire and its dominance in the world, I guess. But then when independence came, they suddenly fell off the radar completely and they were more or less forgotten about. Uh, and now, I guess, slowly we're starting to recover some of these people. But I thought it was a very curious thing that we had this strange relationship with our own science history because if you look at the UK or America, for example, just a simple thing like if you go to look up science historians, you'll find loads of them there in Harvard or in Oxford,
Mm.
departments of them. Whereas in Ireland, we don't. It's not an academic discipline here at all. So it's nearly like we've deliberately or not deliberately we've forgotten about our own history. So I thought I can maybe do my own book that might try and correct this. And I did a hit list of people that I wanted to write about, which included I had to broaden it out because
I
one
was
of
gonna say, yeah, I liked that about the book. I liked that. Yeah.
I'm looking back now at it. It's 10 years ago since this came out. But obviously, you've got people that are through and through Irish. But I broadened it out to include people like Marconi because Marconi had an Irish mother. And so he actually was half Irish and he was completely claimed by the Italians. So I thought, well, if he's half Irish, we can claim him too. And then when I looked into Marconi, a lot of his early experiments were actually done in Ireland. And when he went to get money for some of the things that he wanted to do, for some of the technological things that he wanted to do, the money came from entrepreneurs that his mother knew in Ireland because she was a Jameson, one of the whiskey people, and she knew a lot of business people in the southeast, and he went to them. But in any case, it turned out to be fascinating because a lot of the people that I put on my list. they ended up being important for things that I wouldn't have associated with originally. Like, for example, Beaufort. He's associated with the Beaufort scale, the wind scale, but actually his importance is in cartography and maps, and that was critical for the British Navy, for the British merchants navy all over the world, and also gave the military advantage. So essentially that was the germ, or the kernel of it, if you like, for me, that I just had to look into this, and I didn't,
Mm.
and I got stuck into it, and it took a couple of years to do it, but I got there in the end. So, how did you come up with the idea? Well, I guess you've answered that, but maybe that's
Well, yeah, I think I could probably say a bit more about that. Yeah, how did I come up with the idea? I mean, I guess it was sort of, in some ways, a bit like yourself. Look, I had a question that I just felt I needed to answer. So, as I mentioned, I was a marine biologist and I've written about the oceans, on and off for 20 years. But I suppose I started to think about the high seas, which is basically that part of the ocean that is unowned. It's unclaimed ocean space. And in practical terms, if you think about coastal nations, they've got territorial seas out to 12 nautical miles. Then most of them claim an exclusive economic zone, which goes out to 200 nautical miles, and everything else is the high seas. And basically, I suppose I thought, how did we sort of set that up, that half of our planet basically is unclaimed territory with unclaimed resources? And it's not only half of the surface of the planet, but it's actually 95% of the volume of living space on Earth. And I started to think, that's amazing. And, and how did that ever happen? Who came up with that decision? And sort of, has it benefited us on the whole? So I was really interested in the history of how that decision came about. And I was also really interested in what it means for the future, because I guess, I think we're really just at the beginning of our relationship with the high seas in some ways. Like, the intensity and the scale and the kind of diversity of our like ocean-based activities is really changing, and it's growing. And that's because there's far more people on the planet and we need far more resources, and we're advancing offshore. And so there's all sorts of things that are starting to emerge offshore that have never happened before. Like, deep sea mining is a good example. So this has kind of been a conversation for like at least 50 years, since the 1960s. Nations have thought about mining the deep sea, mining it for rare earth metals, like copper and cobalt and nickel, but no one's ever done it. And it looks likely that it might start next year. The other thing is maybe climate intervention experiments. So, with the kind of growing climate problem, people are looking to the high seas for a solution. They're thinking, well, we could sort of sequester vast quantities of carbon somewhere on the planet. And we've thought about doing it on land, but we've kind of realized there's just too many competing interests in terms of food, in terms of agriculture, and in terms of our own development. So the conversation really has moved to the high seas. And I thought, I just think we're at a sort of a precipice where there's a lot of stuff that's beginning to happen offshore. At least there's a lot of maybe opportunists who sort of have their own agenda for this unclaimed ocean space. And how's that going to pan out? And who's going to decide what happens there? And is that going to benefit the rest of us? So I became really obsessed with this. And I, thought, well, the only way to answer this for myself really is to write a book about it, because how else am I going to devote so much time to this topic? Because there was a lot in it. There was the kind of history of how did this happen? And also, when you think about the high seas, right, you think of a wild west and a frontier, and you think of swashbuckling pirates. And I was like, is that over? Is piracy still a thing? There were so many questions that I had, and I wanted to paint a picture of what had happened in the past and where we're moving to in the future.
so. It was
So
your
that was the concept.
you were curious about something, and
It
you
was just an endless curiosity, that even now that the book is finished, it hasn't stopped, and that I keep on like thinking of other chapters that I could have written, and feeling a bit annoyed that, at some point you have to hand it over. So that's what happened. Yeah.
that's a good reason to do a book, actually, and if
Yeah.
someone's done it. So was your book well mapped out by the time you went looking for a book deal? That's a kind of an interesting.
No. It wasn't. I mean, I've sort of heard that people go looking for book deals at all stages of the process. Like, some people almost have a finished book, right? Or they do have a finished book. And I spoke to a few people who had written books on similar topics. One guy in particular, Colin Roberts, who's a UK academic. He's written lots of influential books about the ocean. And I think Ocean of Life, he's written the unnatural history of the sea. And he said that he was finished his book when he went looking for a book deal, but he told me that far later when I'd already gone down the path I'd gone down. So essentially, no, I basically had a proposal which I put together after this ABSW meeting that I mentioned. And I knew what was supposed to be in a proposal, but like beyond that, I sort of had mapped out what would be in each chapter. And the first few pages of each chapter. But let me say that I don't think any of the words in that proposal ended up in the final book. And the proposal, when I went to the publisher, was probably 20 pages, and it ended up being 67 pages by the time I went looking for the book deal. So even the proposal itself like evolved hugely, maybe in the space of about 2 months. And then I went looking for a book deal through an agent. And then the whole thing just kind of took on a life of its own. And it actually became a travel log. So when I pitched the book, I did not intend to write a travel log. But as I started to sit down and think about it, and opportunities presented themselves, and other people got interested and offered me a berth on their ship going to the Arctic or Antarctica or whatever, it just became bigger and bigger and bigger in my mind. And that was exciting, and I just kind of went with it. Yeah, so it wasn't really the book that entirely that I set out to, it was the book that I set out to write, but it was just different. Like the narrative content was far different, and I think it's a better book for it.
On the book deal, I mean, people might be curious about that. Like,
Yeah.
did you approach many different publishers with your proposal, or how did that happen?
So, basically what happened was I thought, I think I have an idea to write a book. And I just went to a few. So I suppose one of the benefits of having worked at Nature was that a lot of the people who were my former colleagues had written books, like a lot of the people maybe who'd written books in sort of, British science journalists had maybe worked there at some point. So that was handy. And I went to a friend of mine who at that stage was writing her second book and said, look, I think I have an idea for a book. What should I do? And she said, well, you should just find an agent. And actually, I have an agent I can introduce you to. And it turned out that her agent, who his name is Patrick Walsh, and he owns an agency called Pew Literary in London. He's really interested in popular science. He covers all sorts of things, but he has lots of Irish authors. He covers lots of popular science. He's really interested in environment and ethical issues around sort of human rights and stuff. So I sort of fitted his eye, if you know what I mean. And he was just wonderful and extremely helpful. And so I'm not sure I really, it would have been really difficult without him. But because he's been an agent in London for, I guess, decades at this stage. He had a former very successful agency and then set up Pew. And he basically approached different, well, actually what he did was he just had this enormous spreadsheet of publishers. And he just sent out the proposal to everyone at once, and everything was timed so that people would sort of all see it and maybe bid on it at once. And he had a time to go to the US separately, and it was just all entirely handled by him. And then he set up meetings for me either on Zoom or in real life with people who some people, it was interesting because some people, they didn't want to acquire the book, but they were happy to have a conversation with me about it, or they thought that maybe they were interested enough to talk to their team about it, but they didn't know if I'd get a deal. Or some people wanted to offer me a book deal. Other people, I had one person from quite a very well-established publisher who tried to persuade me to write a different book. Something kind of related, but not the same book that I wanted to write. So all of these things happened, but I ended up with quite a few offers. None of them terribly big money, but across a good range of publishers. And that was amazing because then I was able to pick an editor I felt I could really work with.
I guess the thing about the money is the money isn't enormous. That's the thing that we should be, especially in Ireland. I can say on my own behalf that with this one, the print run was 1,500, which in Ireland is, it's big enough. And essentially you're getting a very small amount of money on that. You're getting like, I don't know what it worked out to be, a couple of thousand basically. So you're doing it for money, that's probably the wrong reason to do it.
Yeah, and what about you? Like when you, what was your process? So you basically, I'd love to know a bit more about, you came up with the idea, and did you write the book before approaching a publisher, or how did that all work, like for you?
I knew the nature of the book, that it was going to be probably an Irish publisher and it wouldn't be a big publisher. So I thought
Yeah.
that I like, that I want to work with, that give me a fair bit of freedom and won't be demanding in terms of trying to make edits and everything. So
Okay.
there was actually a lady that I knew who was publishing. She was ex Mercier Press, and she gone out
Yeah.
on her own and she set up this label. Is it called? I'm not sure if it's called a label. Law and Dove Press. So she lives close to me. So I informally kind of chatted to her, as you do in Ireland, because you meet people.
Mm. Yeah.
She checked me out in that she asked a few people, is this guy like what he says he is? Is he a science journalist
Mm.
capable of doing this? And then she came back and she said, listen, yeah, okay, the feedback's been pretty good. Let's work out a contract here. So I had given her an outline of my 17 chapters, and I'd given her, I think, two sample chapters to read, and she was happy.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah, and I think that's pretty common, isn't it? The two sample chapter rule seems to be pretty common. I've been told it's either like two sample chapters or like the first 5 pages of every planned chapter. So I went with the second option. I basically wrote the first few pages of every chapter.
yeah.
I didn't write any chapters in full before I got the book deal.
So just on the agent thing, so the agent worked out well for you.
He'd just kind of give me these prompts and I would go away and do exactly what he's recommended. I would just go and think about it and, write a longer proposal. And then I don't know, he was just incredibly helpful. Like at other stages along the process, like at one stage, and this was kind of one of the really sort of bad things that happened, was that my editor left because he got some incredible promotion in another publishing company. So he left the project at quite a crucial moment. And
That was a
it took my publisher, I would say, like a year to replace him. So there was a period where my agent stepped in and became my editor. And thankfully, he's also a really good editor. So, like, there was this kind of, he was just sort of fixed problems, sorted things out, didn't make a big deal about it, just kind of did whatever I needed to get it done. So, I mean, that was incredible. Yeah, I would really recommend having an agent. I mean, I know you give them a little bit of your whatever, they get a commission, but it's so worth it. And it's just the relationship with that person is so important. It's really, really good.
Yeah, I thought the editor thing is interesting, because that's really important. That was one of the reasons why I went with this lady, because I knew she'd
Yeah.
vast experience. She'd worked for like 20 or 30 years with Mercer Press. Some of the books that she'd been involved with were really successful books, and she got a lot of experience. So I had a lot of respect for her.
Yeah.
And I said, listen, I've got my own ideas on how I'm going to write this. And she said, fire ahead. So I ended up giving it to her in kind of different chunks. I think about three, a third, a third, a third. And then she worked on it. And it was amazing.
Yeah.
You could see how a good editor would improve your text. Did you notice that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think it's so important that the editor you work with has the same vision for the book as you. You
Yeah.
have to share the same vision for the book. And that's something that really, to be honest, I hadn't really thought so clearly about before. I mean, I've now had the experience actually of working with a few different editors on this book, because I had my commissioning editor who left, and then there was this interim person, and then my agent stepped in, and then they replaced my editor. But that was very late in the day. But I suppose I would say it's really important to have someone who definitely is aligned with you on what the book is about and what the audience is, and what you want to achieve with it. So, I mean, it was interesting. So my commissioning editor, the guy who acquired the book title for Profile. So the way it worked actually, and I should probably explain this, is that I have a separate publishing deal in the US versus the UK, and that's really, really common. That basically seems to happen to everyone. I mean, the US publisher, my US publisher is a small independent publisher called Greystone, and they publish a lot of sort of environmental. I mean, one of their probably bigger titles was The Hidden Life of Trees, which was a very successful book. I don't know if you know it, it's kind of amazing. So anyway, they could have published it, like acquired the exclusive rights globally, but the issue is it's kind of useful to have a publishing house that's close to you geographically, because at some point you might need to meet your editor. And also, if you think about it, there's a lot of sort of science festivals and things that happen in the UK. So having a sort of a footing in there is quite good. Anyway, my editor in the UK had published a book called Moneyland, which was about a sort of a lack of regulation in the financial system. You know, and it's very different from Oceans, obviously, but he kind of saw parallels. Essentially, my book is about an unregulated space
Yeah.
and how people are taking advantage of that unregulated space. So in some ways, it's a bit like the financial system, right? There's people who, they set up whatever, I don't know, they have tax evasion in St. Kitts and Nevis. It's not that different maybe to a fishing fleet finding an unregulated part of the Indian Ocean and fishing the hell out of it for squid, that has no quota. So there's all of these parallels in some ways between those books. And I found the conversations with him about those sorts of possibilities were really helpful. I thought he really got the idea behind the book and helped me to think about it.
Did
So
you know
yeah, I think it's
writing?
really important to
Did
choose the
you
right editor.
did you have an idea of who you were writing for? Like when you were writing the book, did you have somebody in mind, like a single person, or were you just writing for the general public, or what did you have in mind?
Actually, do you know, I've always thought my husband is a good person to
Oh,
think about,
yeah,
because I mean, look, he has a degree in science, so he's not like completely disinterested, but essentially he's, like he wouldn't read a lot of popular science books. And I thought if it appeals to him, I'm kind of, in a good place, because I think, he would be a sort of a good example of a very general reader, like someone he likes the kind of, the skullduggery and the politics, and he could get through a certain amount of the science to get those stories. Does
yeah,
that make sense?
it does. Yeah, and did
Yeah.
you own the text?
Yeah. So I thought he was kind of my target reader. He actually hasn't read the book.
He hasn't read the.
He was my person in mind. I was like, if I could get him to like it, then I'm okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not one of the questions we originally agreed, but I'm going to throw it out there because I think it's important.
Okay.
What about the confidence issue? I know I've got something to say about that as well. Like, there's a big difference between writing articles for the newspapers and magazines and online, etc., and then taking the jump to write a book. For me, anyway, there was a massive amount of confidence that I thought I had, but then I wobbled a little bit for a while. What happened with you?
Mm. Oh yeah, like you're really faced with your own demons in a way, aren't you? Like you sort of feel your own limitations. So I definitely confronted all of that. Yeah, I mean, I could probably actually speak about that for an hour, just in terms of
5 minutes anyway.
it's so illuminating. I feel like you really get to know yourself very well writing a book. And I got to know a lot about myself in terms of the process. I mean, look, things happened that I didn't expect to happen, particularly the lockdown. And I had sea trips that I was supposed to go on that were cancelled. I had to reinvent narratives for whole chapters because of that. I was homeschooling my kids at the time. I was teaching at Johns Hopkins. I was still freelancing, and I felt like I was spinning way too many plates. And I don't know about your process, but for me, I've realized it's really about uninterrupted hours.
Yeah.
Like I just need uninterrupted hours to get something down on paper that I'm really happy with. So I think most of what I wrote in that period probably ended up in the bin, and that was really difficult. I really definitely reached a point where I thought it was never going to happen. I just thought I just don't know if I can finish this, because just the conditions aren't conducive to me finishing this. And then, of course, once you get wobbly, and then my editor left, and you just think, oh my God, how do I get the wheel back on this? But like, it's amazing. Like, it did happen again. And it was, once I picked it up again, it was fine. So it was good. So it's great to actually get through it, right? Because then you do have renewed self confidence. You feel, oh, I did it once. I could definitely do it again, and I think, yeah, that's probably the hardest part, isn't it? Like there's one chapter in particular I can think of that like I probably wrote 10 drafts of it.
Yeah.
And I'd say the problem was the starting point, like just the entry point for that chapter. It was so, I was just like, where do I start this story? You know, that was so difficult. So there were so many times I was just like ripped it up, and you know, and you know what, the good thing is coming back to feature writing afterwards, you just feel like it's just not that big a deal if you have to shop out a couple of paragraphs, you decide something isn't working. I think I have a much more flexible mind about things now. Like
Yeah.
sometimes it's just not working for you, and that's okay. You know, it doesn't mean that you won't get there. Like
It
it's
sounded like you had to
fine.
be very flexible and that you had a
Yeah.
outline for the book in your head at the start, but that had to change. And that you,
Yeah.
so were you happy with how the changes happened? Or, are you happy with the book now that it's done?
Yeah. I'm really happy. And I'm really happy for things like that I fought to keep in that maybe, you know, some people would have questioned or that I had to really think hard about. Yeah, I'm really happy. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm happy. I mean, of course, there's things that I'm like, oh, I wish I had more of this or that, or, you know, yeah, but like I'm happy with the way it worked out. Yeah.
And were you one of these people like that thought about writing a book when you were a kid, or was this a dream that you had?
I don't think so. I don't like, I think for me, like when I started with science journalism, the sort of dream was always like long format, um, just narrative writing. And in some ways, it was the first time I really got to do that because it's written as a series of vignettes, which is, you know, like each chapter is a different story, looking at a different sort of way that this thing is panning out offshore. Okay. So in one chapter, I go to Antarctica and it's, you know, all about the kind of conflicts between conservationists and fishers. Um, and other chapters about deep sea mining. So it's sort of, you know, a series of stories. And I guess it just really allowed me to just play around with words more, you know, to really describe things in more detail, to have more characters. And I think, you know, some of that, obviously, that presents structural challenges too, right? Like your transitions suddenly become this thing of like, how am I going to transition from this historic segment to me back counting penguins or whatever, you know? So I found that those, like, yeah, it was much more challenging than anything I've ever done. Like, it was way more challenging than my PhD
Yeah,
by like an absolute mile. You know, some people are like, "Oh, was it as bad as your PhD?" I'm like, "There's just
much
no
worse.
comparison." Yeah, yeah, for sure. But really satisfying. The most satisfying thing I've ever done professionally, like 100%. Yeah,
And
yeah,
about point of view where you write from your, is that how you wrote it? Like your own experience. This is my,
yeah. Yes. I mean, for the most part, yeah, yeah.
okay.
I mean, like, so most of the chapters, not all of them, are sort of me on a somewhere doing something, but they're not all like that. So I would say it's a part travelogue. Yeah,
Yeah. And you were saying
yeah.
that kind of evolved into a travelogue. It didn't necessarily start.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in the proposal, I sort of said, you know, I might visit a few labs, talk to a few people who were doing this research. I just didn't sort of, actually, what happened was, you know, I just didn't really conceive of the fact that I might be able to go to quite a lot of these places. And in fact, what happened was once I had secured the book deal, um, I my agent suggested I talk to Colin Roberts, who's this author I mentioned earlier, and he's written quite a number of ocean books and has the same agent as me. And Colin was really amazingly generous with his time and full of great suggestions. But one thing which was fantastic was he said, "Do you know that Greenpeace are doing this like year-long expedition through the high seas with scientists?" Which I didn't know. And he said, "If I'll put you in touch with them and you might be able to join them for some of the expedition." So Greenpeace basically said to me, "Look, you can come on any part of this you want. You can come to sea with us basically pretty much for a year if you want, as long as you can get a commission for every place that you go to." So if I was going to the Arctic, I had to, you know, make sure that I was writing a feature. I think I wrote a piece for National Geographic for that part. And then I went to Antarctica with them, and I think I did something for BBC Wildlife. So I always had to have an immediate outcome for their media department. So that was the arrangement. But then I thought, you know, I don't really want to just be at sea with Greenpeace. I needed to be much more balanced than that. So I had other bits where I went to sea with these prospective deep sea miners, and yeah, I just sort of got into the whole thing of trying to find opportunities to go to sea, or, not always to sea, but maybe to different places to meet people who are really on the front line of this and trying to solve the problem.
And you have to
Yeah.
kind of cut yourself off, don't you? Like I found that what I had to do was to get up really early. It was the only way I could do it
Yeah.
because I was young when I was writing this book, and that was the only
Yeah.
way there was any peace. So I
Yeah.
had to be really determined because I was getting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I kind of, there was a definitely a period of, I'd say at least 2 years when I was probably up at 5 every morning. And yeah, I don't, like my brain doesn't really work for writing, I would say, all in the evenings. Like there's no way that I could write a book in the evening. That just wouldn't happen for me. But I can get up really early and do it. Yeah. Are you the same?
Yeah, I'm the same, which is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I just,
Found that
yeah.
at night time when I was trying to write, because I allocated time at night between 9 and 11 when I would write, I was too tired.
Oh,
And
yeah.
any kind of creative type thing just wasn't happening. Whereas in
Yeah.
the morning, I would wake up and it was completely silent.
Yeah.
You get ideas. It was brilliant.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
had to change it around.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be flexible. The other thing, I sort of had this idea when I started on this that it was just hours at the desk. Like the more hours I sat at the desk, the more I'd get done. But it doesn't quite work like that. Like I think, I figured that I write a certain amount and then I'll sort of hit a bit of an obstacle. And the best thing is I just, I have this hill near my house and I've probably, I don't know, walked around it about a million times. People just probably see me walking around talking to myself. But if I have a hard transition or I have something that I need to kind of really describe, I just figure it out on the walk. Sometimes I'll take notes on my phone, like I'll just voice record some notes and then I'll get back and do it. I'll have another crack at the whip when I get back. But just sitting there for hours on end can be just frustrating. Like it's just not conducive to creativity, really.
Yeah, you have to move. I think I found I
Yeah.
had to walk or I started running a bit, and you get out
Yeah.
when you're doing that, but definitely not when you're just sitting there. But having said
Yeah.
that, you do have to sit in front of the computer too
Yeah.
and just
You
put in.
do. Yeah, it's quite sedentary, isn't it?
Yeah. So, what did you enjoy most about the book?
I think like there were some things that I really enjoyed, like getting really deep into the science on some things. So there's one chapter that I've written about the ocean's twilight zone. So this is kind of a layer of the ocean, a mid layer between 100 and 1,000 meters. So it's not quite the abyss, but it's far enough down that light is beginning to dissipate. And what's really interesting, there's loads of really interesting stuff about the Twilight Zone, but I like a lot of the beasts that live there. They're these little mini beasts, but they have huge jaws and they're bioluminescent. They're incredible creatures. But in the last sort of 10 years, scientists have figured out, well, some scientists, this is questionable, right? But there's been a kind of a controversy over this, but some scientists have said that there's that the biomass of fish in the twilight zone is basically greater than all of the existing fisheries on Earth. Okay, so this is a completely unharvested realm of the ocean, and because the species are tiny, the idea is we could fish them for fish meal, and that would produce resources for aquaculture. But there's all this sort of thinking that really this is a very important way of bringing carbon from the surface of the ocean down to the deep sea. So the question is, like, if we remove a portion of these fish, what does that do to the climate? And just digging into that question was so interesting. Like understanding how carbon gets down to the deep sea is really interesting. And there's things that I might have understood superficially, but then now I feel I appreciate in much more detail. So I think that was probably like the really satisfying bit. But obviously the travel was really good fun, and it was great to go to places that I wouldn't have ever otherwise have thought that I'd get to go to. So
Sounds,
yeah, those were the cool things, I think.
sounds like learning stuff, new things is important.
Yeah, just so interesting. What about you? What was your
Oh yeah,
most interesting bit?
I have to be learning, and
Yeah.
what did I enjoy most about it? I guess when I read back some of it, I thought this isn't bad. I would read this.
Yeah.
I thought, if I was trying to be fair to
Cool.
myself, I thought this is okay.
Yeah.
And then I
Yeah.
encouraged myself to think, God, you can do this and you can do a reasonable job, and you keep going. And then it became a little bit more pleasurable because I was thinking, I'm not awful at this. I can do a reasonable job at it.
Mm.
So you gain confidence as you go along, I think.
Yeah.
So, and then towards the end, I rewrote a lot of chapters because I thought, well, the reason that a lot of these people are famous is not the real reason why they should be famous. And
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
I'm
Okay. And was that because of your own research and reporting during the book? You just discovered all this other stuff.
just started reading about people and realizing, hang on a second, we've got that person totally wrong. Like
Yeah. So interesting.
Kelvin, for example, like we think of the Kelvin scale, that's the first thing you think of. But actually, he was much more important because his whole transatlantic cable, which was
Oh, yeah.
New York and London, that was really important at the time, and that he was brought in to do that. So that really was his thing. That was what he should be remembered for. But on the other side of the coin, then, what were the parts you didn't enjoy?
Um, well, I think I found it quite sedentary and solitary. Like by the end of it, I was just dying to see people. I just felt like, I mean, I'm quite a sociable person and I like being quite active. So, you know, those things were just over such a long period, yeah, I guess people always say, there is that bit of writing a book where you're really on your own doing it, but then you get out in the world and you get to talk to people about your book, and then it becomes really sociable. So I'm sort of beginning to enjoy some of that now. Like the book's finished and it's not out yet. Like it's not out until May next year, but I'm beginning to have conversations about related topics, and that's really great. But yeah, I found that challenging, and also I think just COVID, and that was such a kind of a period of the doldrums in terms of writing for me. And I think as well, just yeah, my editor leaving and sort of having to like navigate that challenge. So there were a few unforeseen challenges along the way, but yeah, those weren't the bad bits. What about you? Did you have any bad bits?
Bad bits. Let me think. No, I didn't really. I kind of I enjoyed it. the
Yeah.
well, getting on to the bad bits, the novel that I've written, which is totally
Oh
different,
yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
isn't the subject for this conversation. But yeah, there were some bad bits there because just a collapse of confidence completely. Thinking, I'm a journalist. I'm not able to write this novel. There's no way I can do this. This is absolute garbage. And then a little bit of a crisis like that. But then it's funny when
Mm,
you talk to other people that are trying to do the same thing. Like I joined a writers group, and there were a lot of people that had the exact same experience. And
yeah.
then you get encouragement because, like you, I'm fairly social, so it's hard to be on your own. You need to be
Mm,
part of some kind of group. So for me, it was
yeah.
the group. Again, the solitary bit was the bit. Maybe that's the tough bit about writing, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And so you got out of that funk, the self-doubt funk, by reaching out to other people and just realizing they were all having a similar experience.
Exactly. Like I was out of my comfort zone with the novel. With the novel, this here
Yeah,
kind of my comfort zone because I love history, I love science, so
yeah,
I felt more confident when I was writing this book. But as soon as I was outside of my comfort zone, I kind of panicked a bit. Uh,
yeah.
but that's when I needed other people to come in and say, "Listen, you can do it. I've been there."
Mm.
In terms of advice that you would give, so if there's somebody listening to this and you've got the experience now, have gone through the whole thing, um, and of course, we've made mistakes. I've made mistakes along the way too, I'm sure. What would you say to people? What advice would you give them?
Well, I think it's pretty important to think about the sort of how it fits into your life when you're setting out. And I mean, not just in terms of like the time, obviously for one, but the finances as well. Like I guess if you've got a staff job and you're doing it in the evenings, or you can get up really early in the morning, maybe that's totally feasible and you can just fit it in around your working life. And I know lots of people who do that and have done that really successfully. Um, but as I said, it's not really, you're not going to make really any money probably out of your first book. I mean, you might, but chances are you won't. You need to be doing it for other reasons. Um, and just being aware of sort of all of those, like, I mean, I think I was probably quite naive about the whole sort of, I don't know, when you get into the kind of, contracts of a book deal, and like, I think even if you have a book idea that's going to take a long time, like they always want you to deliver it within a year usually. So just being aware of that and thinking, I mean, obviously I did not deliver my book within a year. and that was fine. So, but what?
Did you get penalized in any way for that? Not.
No, no, not at all. Because I think, look, it changed. It wasn't supposed to be a travel log. And I think even just like the first year was just taken up with planning the travel and persuading people to let me go to sea with them and all of that. So that was a whole year gone. And then by the time I was literally had just returned from Antarctica. I think I was a week back from Antarctica when news of COVID started to emerge. So, I think there was obviously a dispensation for the circumstances and just the fact that like it wouldn't really have been that easy to do it in that time scale. But generally, publishers always want you to do it within a year, maybe 18 months. And just some of the things that you need to be aware of. Then, like once you finish the book and it's everything is agreed and it's even, been copy edited and whatever, then it still takes them a year to publish it
Yes.
after that. And in the US, it's often 18 months
Yeah.
after you've handed it over. So it's a really long journey, and you have to think about like, will I have sustained interest in this one area for that long? And of course, once it comes out, then you have obligations, and also you want to get out and promote it and talk about it. So you just need to think about that, really, about the journey of like, are you really interested and devoted enough to this to do it? But yeah, I think if I was advising anyone to write it, who wanted to write a book, I would say definitely get an agent, definitely get someone to look at your contracts
Yeah.
and think about the reality of, can you deliver this in the timescale that they're asking you to? What with everything else that's going on in your life?
I guess you can negotiate a contract even, if you haven't written your book, you can still go in there and negotiate.
And it probably depends on whether more than one publisher wants to publish it and how attractive it is as a book proposal. All of those things probably weigh, in terms of how much you can negotiate. But there's often things in the contract that are funny, like, for example, in a lot of publishing contracts, they say that you're obliged to publish your next book, to pitch it to them, that
Okay.
they have the first right of reply on your next book. And, that's quite a big thing, right? Because then you're sort of contractually bound to this publisher potentially in perpetuity. I mean, I didn't have that with my UK publisher, but I'm just saying that that's pretty common.
Would you do it again, Olive? Are you
I
planning it?
would. Oh my God, I would. It's like I'm like someone who's had a baby and you forget the pain.
Yeah.
You're like, I'd never do it again. Then you're like, oh, maybe I would. Yeah, I think I probably would, and I think it would only be if I had that same feeling of, I just have to scratch this itch. Like, this is just something that I can't stop thinking about and I want to know the answers. And, it was just this sort of, like, it was amazing. When I was writing the book, it was the first thing I thought about every morning when I woke up. Like, I would think about some question that I wanted to know the answer to. And then, I was just always thinking about it all the time. And that was really satisfying. Like, you really go into the zone with it, don't you? So, I mean, that's quite pleasurable. And I think if I found a topic that I felt passionately about, I would do it again. Yeah.
Olive, thanks a million. It's been great talking.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting.
All the best. Bye.
Bye.